Assalamualaikum and greetings. Today we would like to present about our research paper that is titled The Result of Macroeconomic Variables on the Stock Market Performance in the Time of COVID-19, the case of ASEAN country Malaysia, Indonesia and Singapore. Firstly, I would like to introduce our group members, which are myself, Muhammad Hikal bin Muhammad Salim, FAWWAZ bin Mohammad, Muin Ali ABQARI bin FAZLI, Muhammad ALIFF bin Muhammad ZANI, and lastly, Muhammad ZAID AIDIL bin ISMAIL. Without further ado, I would like to pass the presentation to Zaid for his part.
Thank you, Hikal. To start with, the coronavirus disease 19 or COVID-19 is the most critical topic that has affected the economy worldwide. COVID-19 pandemic is a newly discovered strain of coronavirus that can cause infection to the respiratory system. According to the World Health Organization (WHO), the coronavirus was firstly discovered at Wuhan, China in December 2019, and COVID-19 has severely impacted the performance of the global economy. Hence, the research focused on the effect of COVID-19 to the Asian country performance, or more specifically to the economy of Malaysia, Indonesia and Singapore economic performance. The purpose of this study is to analyze the gross domestic product (GDP) growth rate, unemployment rate, inflation rate or CPI, balance of trade and changes of COVID-19 cases of the selected country during the pandemic COVID-19 and before the pandemic towards the stock market indices. This is to identify the severity of the pandemic COVID-19 to the economic performance in Malaysia, Indonesia and Singapore towards the stock market performance. Next. Throughout the research, we would aim to provide additional proof of the macroeconomic variable affecting the stock market before and after COVID-19 pandemic. Here is the problem statement for this research. The first one is, what is the relationship between GDP growth rate with the stock market? The second one is, what is the relationship between the unemployment rate with the stock market? And the third one is, what is the relationship between inflation rate with the stock market? The fourth one is, what is the relationship between the balance of trade with the stock market? And lastly, what is the relationship between changes of COVID-19 cases with the stock market? As for objective, the main objective for the study is to observe whether macroeconomic variable affect the ASEAN stock market or vice versa in times of before and after COVID-19 spreading. The other objective for this research are, the first one is to investigate how the macroeconomic variable affect the ASEAN countries' stock market in the time of before and after COVID-19. The second one is to observe what is the relationship between macroeconomic variable and the stock market performance for ASEAN countries. The third one is to analyze the movement of the macroeconomic variable and the stock market performance before and after COVID-19. And lastly, to describe possible macroeconomic variable effect on major stock market indices in ASEAN countries before and after the COVID-19 pandemic. That is all from me. I would like to pass this presentation to FAWWAZ.
Thank you, Zaid, for your nice presentations. So now moving on to the dependent variable and the independent variables. The variables that we have used on this research paper, which act as the dependent variables, is the stock market performance on these three selected Asian countries. These data are collected from the Market Watch websites. Furthermore, the independent variables, which are GDP growth rate, balance of trade, unemployment rate, and consumer price index, are collected from the trading economics websites. However, the changes on COVID-19 cases data are collected from the World Health Organization or WHO websites, and the data that we have collected are taken in the quarterly basis. So now I will pass the next presentation to Muin Adli.
Okay, thank you, Fawaz. Next, we move to theoretical framework. The theoretical framework development provides a better understanding and a clear picture of what we are trying to deliver in our study. So this is primarily aimed at determine the significant relationship between independent variable and dependent variable. So in our study, we use the stock market in each country as the dependent variable, and the independent variable is macroeconomic indicator, which is GDP growth rate, consumer price index, unemployment rate, balance of trade, and changes in percentage of COVID-19 cases in each country. So next is hypothesis development. The non-directional hypothesis for null hypothesis HO is there is no significant relationship between independent variable and dependent variable. And the alternative hypothesis H1 is there is significant relationship between independent variable and dependent variable, which is the three selected ASEAN countries stock market performance. For example, the GDP growth rate, the HO is there is no significant relationship between GDP growth rate and the three selected ASEAN countries stock market performance. And the H1 is there is significant relationship between GDP growth rate and the three selected ASEAN countries stock market performance. And as well as for others independent variable for the null hypothesis HO and alternative hypothesis H1. Next, I will pass this presentation to Alif. Thank you.
Thank you, Mohammad, for the excellent presentation. Now we will proceed to the research methodology of this research. First, we use is Penalty square regression analysis. Second is descriptive analysis. Third is correlation analysis. Fourth is covariance analysis. And lastly, normality analysis test. First, Penalty square regression analysis have three components, which is F-test, T-test, and coefficient of determination. F-tests are used to test of null hypothesis of a group regression slope coefficient between dependent and dependent variable, while for the t-test is used to test hypothesis about individual regression slope coefficient between dependent and independent variable, and it also indicate the independent variable have the positive or negative relationship. And lastly, coefficient of determination or R squared is explained on how much changeability in a variable can be attributed to another variable relationship. Now we will proceed to the descriptive analysis, which have several components, which is mean, median, mode of central tendency, standard deviation and variance, and lastly kurtosis and skewness. For the mean is the central tendency that can be detected by calculating the average value of the set data. For the median is can be detected by the midpoint value of the set data that we use. And for the mode is the value of the most repetitive data that we use in the sample for our research. For the standard deviation and variance is used to detect the raw data from the mean of the set of data. And lastly, the kurtosis and skewness. Kurtosis is a tail to measure the normal distribution of data, while the skewness is the function to detect the asymmetry of the normal distribution, whether it's positive skewness or negative skewness. Now we proceed to the correlation analysis. A correlation analysis is linear correlation between both dependent and independent variable. For the correlation analysis, the correlation that value higher than 0.8 show the high correlation on the both variable, while the correlation with the zero value is indicate no relation between both the variable about dependent and independent variable. Now we proceed to the covariance analysis, which is the relationship of two variables whenever one variable change. So for the covariance, a positive number indicate that they have a positive relationship, while for the negative number indicate that there is inverse relationship or negative relationship between the two variables. And lastly, for the normality test, is to identify whether test is normally distributed or not normally distributed. Normality test can be tested by using Jacques-Berra, and if the Jacques-Berra value is above than 5%, it shows that the significant level and the researcher must accept the norm hypothesis, and it also shows the data is normally distributed. That's all from me. I pass to Hikal.
Alright, thank you, Alif, for the presentation. So I will be talking about findings and discussions. So as you can see from the slide, is the penalty squared regression analysis findings and descriptive analysis finding. So based on the equation below, we can see that the independent variable of consumer price index and balance of trade (BOT) has shown negative coefficient with the changes in the stock market performance, while the gross domestic product growth and employment rate and also the changes in percentage in COVID-19 has positive coefficient with the stock market performance. F statistics based on the table above are 91.68722, and F statistic for the p-value is 0.0 So based on the result that we get, we need to reject the null hypothesis because p-value significant level is under 0.05. That means that all independent variables that we choose, it has at least one or two variables that are useful that can affect the dependent variable. So moving on to the descriptive analysis finding, based on the independent variable that have the same unit, the highest mean and median for this research is balance of trade, and with the value of 5,941.165 and 4,252.703. As for the minimum mean and median, it goes to GDP growth with a value of 0.44 and 0.60. On the other hand, the data highest value is 6,468.67 and the lowest data is 7.07. So in comparison, the highest standard deviation is 5,869.54, which is a balance of trade, and the lowest skewness is GDP growth, which indicates negative 0.354886. Finally, yet importantly, the highest value of kurtosis is 15.30165, which is the V changes in COVID-19, while the lowest of the kurtosis is 1.515388, which is the consumer price index. So moving on to the next slide is multi-correlated test. So in the multi-correlated test, it has a correlation table and also variance inflation factors. So the correlation between consumer price index and balance of trade from the correlation table is high, which is at 0.8162, which has high correlation, meaning that multi-correlated exists between these independent variables. It means that CPI and balance of trade can give the same redundant data information to the research. Moving on to the variance inflation factor, there are two variables that have a high centered VIF more than 4, which is also CPI and balance of trade. So this means that CPI and balance of trade have multi-correlated. When there is multi-correlated in the model, the information of the data may be excessive. Thus, we need to solve this problem. So this will be discussed by FAWWAZ in the conclusion. So next. Moving on to the next slide is normality test finding. So we combine covariance and normality tests here. So first we'd like to talk about the hypothesis. Null hypothesis is data is normally distributed, and the other hypothesis is data is not normally distributed. So the value of probability of Jab Bera is 0.10705, in which is larger than 5% significance level. So the null hypothesis is not rejected due to its being larger than the significance level, meaning that the data is normally distributed. The purpose of measuring the skewness is for determining the degree of symmetry of the distribution of the model. In our study, the skewness is valued at negative 0.788207, in which negative skewness that can be interpreted as the distribution that has a long left tail which is skewed to the left. So for the kurtosis value, in which the value is more than 3 and can be said as the distribution is fat tail or leptocrotic. So the covariance analysis, so from the covariance table, we can see that the strongest correlation between two independent variables are consumer price index and also balance of trade, in which they have a closest value of to positive 1, meaning a strong positive relationship between each other. So when consumer price index and balance of trade have a high relationship value, it means that they are moved together positively way. So I will move past this presentation to FAWWAZ.
Thank you, Hikal, for your specific presentations. So in conclusion from our research paper, we have identified the multi-collinearity in the two variables, which are the consumer price index or CPI and the balance of trade or BOT. Moreover, for the covariance, we have identified that the consumer price index and balance of trades variables has a high degree of relationships to each other. So moving on to the recommendation. The first recommendation is that this research paper requires a longer time period as the data that is provided is still insufficient, such as the COVID-19 cases. The second suggestion is by addressing the multi-collinearity in the model, which by dropping one or two highly correlated variables, increasing the sample size and ignore the multi-collinearity. The third suggestion is that we need to do more comprehensive testing towards the model, as there are a lot of tests that can be used towards the model. The last recommendation that we can add to this research paper is adding more samples of countries, as this will cover a larger sample of nations that can make the research paper more appealing to a wider audience. So that is all from us. Thank you for your time and your attention.